How about now? Yes,
Oh,
I think
yeah.
we got it. We're
Yeah,
good.
now you sound all proper.
Okay, guys, thanks for hanging in. Really appreciate it. I don't know what happened. So I'm not really going to play guitar. It's going to fade out. And okay, we solved it. I'll cut all this out in the replay. Thanks so much for hanging. Okay, so Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. After
Hey,
and
thanks for
hanging
having
in
me on,
there.
Jeff. It's a
Yeah,
pleasure.
it's a ton of fun. And now he's a little. Hopefully his audio and video will catch up. Okay, good. Um, I'm a huge fan of your work. First of all, as a guitar player, I think you're a
Thank you.
really amazing guitar player. So if everybody gets a chance to go over to Simon's page or go over to check him out at that pedal store, that pedal show, there's a few times where you're featured is with your playing as well. And man, what a great player! And I really want to stress like what a great guitar player. I know you're bashful about it, as anybody would, but I wanted to say that's just as good. The reason why I think your pedals sound so good is also because you play so well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very
Yeah,
much. That's very much appreciated. And that means a lot coming from somebody of your caliber,
thank
a
you.
caliber to which I can only strive for.
Oh, well, you're too kind. You're too kind. Okay, so what I was saying, and there's lots of stuff to talk about with your pedals, but the way I end up using it, and the way that Matt Schofield and I were talking about, and he was actually the one that turned me on your pedals, as did the pedal show, right about the same exact time, was going on the road, and it's hard to rent gear. When you rent gear, it's almost always something like a hot rod DeVille. That seems to be the sort of the industry standard. And I've gotten used to those, but I've never been so crazy about the way they sound. They're really good amps, but I'm kind of spoiled with some of the amplifiers that I have. And I go on a gig and you're striving to make this thing sound as good as possible. So what one of the pedals in your line that you have is basically the preamp section of a few different amp models. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that and we can,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, I was making amplifiers, tube amps, and I started to experiment with the preamps in those amplifiers quite a lot. And one interesting thing that I ended up doing on some amp models is I'd have a two-channel amp with a clean channel and an overdrive channel. And one interesting way to run the overdrive channel I found was instead of running it straight into the power amp, I would actually route it back into the clean channel. So I'd have a two-channel amp, clean and dirty, and the dirt side could either go straight into the power amp or it could go into the clean side. And when you run it into the clean side, you have to make some adjustments to the circuit tonally and volume wise to make it work into essentially the front end of the amp. But anyway, once I got this sorted out, and these amps I'm talking about would be like the Tone Baron and the Deluxe 32. They had a series parallel option for the dirt channel, and in series it would cascade into the clean channel. So I was messing with those circuits, and they seemed to be working quite well. So basically, all I had to do to put these in pedals was I just had to take that preamp circuit out of the amp and put it in a pedal with those circuit adjustments to make it more appropriate for driving the front end of an amp. So my first pedals were actually designed to go into the front of an amp rather than into an effects return. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But, and so those were things like the Jester and the Page and the Harlot pedals, which are still quite popular. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and this is a regular Page. You've got the Page TS there, I see. This is a simpler 3-knob Page. And those pedals work well into the front of any typical amp, be it a Fender or a Marshall or a Boogie, what have you. Now, because they were already derived from a tube amplifier running at high voltage in an amp, it didn't take much for me to go, well, hold on a minute. Why am I adjusting the output of this circuit to make it all friendly to the input of an amp? Why don't I just run it as it was originally meant, as a full output preamplifier? And then it wouldn't be so suitable for running into the front of an amp, but it would be suitable for running into a power amp, right? Mm-hmm. So I started making these pedals, which I label as preamps, as opposed to front of amp pedals, or FOA, front of amp. So these preamp pedals, you could run into a dedicated power amp, or if you didn't have one of those, a lot of amps have effects loops, and so they have an effects send and an effects return. So if you run into the effects return, well, you've got access to your amp's power amplifier. So the effects return becomes essentially a power amp in jack. Now, so the advantage of doing this instead of running into the front of an amp is just that when you run into a power amp directly, you have a more neutral um, foundation. So the power amplifier has a flatter frequency response than the front end of your amp. If you plug into a Fender Blackface amp, it has a kind of a scoop mid and lots of bass and treble. And if you bypass that and run into the power amp, you don't get any of that. You get a kind of dull, flat response, which is actually a great building block for running a variety of different preamps into. So if you have, like you mentioned, say a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe or DeVille or something, you can bypass the preamp. And then you've got this blank canvas, so to speak, so you can turn it into a considerably different sounding amplifier by using different types of preamplifier. I'm sure I wasn't the first guy to do this. There's lots of people been making preamps forever. In the 80s and the 90s, they were very big in rack mount style, right? So everybody was using like Soldano rack mount preamps and Bogner preamps and things like that. So I just took those ideas and put them in pedal form. That's all, kind of tried to shrink them down. And and so it just turns out that they work great into the effects return of, say, a Hot Rod Deluxe, and you can make your amp take on a different flavor than it had before. It may or may not be better. It's subjective, of course, whether you prefer your amp's preamp or whether you prefer an external preamp. Or maybe you want an external preamp, not because it gives you a better sound, but because it just gives you a different sound. So you could get, say, a Marshall flavored preamp and plug it into a Fender effects return and get that Marshall front end sound. And it won't be the full Marshall experience because you're still going into the Fender power amp, but it does take you quite a long way there. Yeah. So it's just a versatile way to make your rig more versatile, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it. And I'm sorry. So what I find so useful, and what I wanted to share with everybody, is it's a great way to be able to try different sort of amplifiers without having to, or have different sounds in your arsenal without having to buy a Marshall or a Dumble or these other sort of things. And they work great into just power amps themselves, which really makes a great portable rig. And some of my friends are doing that. A friend of mine just bought a Constable, and he's flipping out over it because he is plugging it into a solid state power amp, but he was like, but it just feels great and it feels so much better. And then with the Juggler, what it's been great, and when I was on the road, I used the Maiden, your Maiden pedal, which I have over here in my box. And what this one is this is the front end of Maiden D. This is the front end of a Dumble sort of idea kind of sound, right? This was the earlier version.
That's right. Yeah. There's a couple of there was a Maiden D and a Maiden BF. The BF being modeled after a Fender Blackface or Black Panel amp,
right,
with the black knobs.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a Fender version, and this is also the version 3. No, version 2. Excuse me.
That's version 2. Yeah, I have the separate.
Yeah, you have the version 1. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. This just has an EQ lift foot switch and a couple of other features.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have an external EQ lift. It's built in on this one. Yeah. So you have the one based upon the clean channel of a Dumble ODS style circuit.
Right. And so what I did on the road was I plugged it into a hot rod when the last time I used it was on the Czech Republic, and I have used it in New York, where I just plug it in and I have a reverb on my board. So certain things you want to be careful of if you decide to do this at home. Certain power amps will bypass your reverb entirely. So you become your power amp becomes just the power amp. So that's something to think about. So if you have reverb that you love in your amp, you may or may not be able to get that reverb depending on how the power amp is routed. And that's important to know. So with the hot rods, it bypasses all of it. And with the hot rods, just to be noticed, they also are on full volume. So they're very, very loud. And
the power amp is wide open, right? Yeah. So when you go into the effects return of an amplifier, you are at the mercy of the effects return circuitry and where it's placed in the signal chain of the amplifier, right? So typically, if you think about effects loops, if you think pre-effects loops, like classic amps from the 60s and 70s, they didn't have effects loops. And you basically had a preamp which would hit the power amplifier. So when they started to experiment with adding gain in the preamplifier of guitar amplifiers, say back in the 70s, the Marshall master volume amps and other amps which added master volumes, that enabled the player to get some drive out of the preamplifier. And that brought up the problem that, well, now when you place effects before your amplifier, you're effectively placing overdrive after those effects, which is not optimal. So when you want to add delay or reverb, typically we want those, in most cases, to be after the preamp. So the effects loop was born, right? And the effects loop basically places your time-based effects after your preamp, in between the preamp and the power amplifier. So now preamplifier generated overdrive can cascade into reverb, delay, what have you, and then go onto the power amplifier. Now, part of that effects loop design, there's different types of effects loops. The first ones were very simple passive designs, simply a patch point between the preamp and the power amp. And those ones actually are quite good for use with our preamps because there's no extra circuitry. So really you're getting the preamplifier directly into the power amplifier if you have an amplifier with a passive loop. Most amps these days don't have passive loops, and I understand why, because they've got their own issues, passive loops. But if you do happen to have one with a passive loop, like say many Dr. Z amplifiers, matchless amplifiers, then they're actually a really good platform for plugging in different preamps because they'll be less colored by the effects loop circuitry because it's a passive loop. Now, effects loops, usually an active effects loop has a buffer stage, so that buffers the output of your preamp so that it can effectively drive your effects. And then on the return stage, it usually has a gain stage, a return gain stage. So you have a way to bring the signal back up to the level that the power amplifier wants to see. Because if you run, I'm probably not being very clear here. If you run a full preamp into a delay or reverb pedal, you'll just overdrive it and it'll clip way more than it's designed, right? So a proper active effects loop, what it does is it attenuates the preamplifier signal. And then because it's attenuated, it has to be brought back up to the level that the power amplifier wants to see. So the return of your effects loop usually incorporates a return gain stage. And if you're using an effects loop in a traditional manner, then that's a useful thing to have. Now, if you're plugging in preamplifiers into the effects return of an amplifier, well, you've introduced an extra gain stage, right? The return gain stage. And that may or may not be a problem, or it may or may not be optimal for the tone you're seeking, right? And so that's where effects loops become complicated, and there's a lot of different designs. And that's one of the things that you have to deal with, of course, when you're doing this. The good news is that most effects loops these days are the typical effects loop has an attenuated buffered send, and then it has a return stage which boosts your level back up. And the return stage should be designed to be pretty neutral. So if you plug a preamp into the return, like say on your 2-rock, I'm sure it sounds just fine, you know. Or indeed, if you plug into the effects return of say a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, it sounds fine too, up to a point. Some of the differences that might be worth considering are if that return gain stage is a tube driven design or if it's a solid state return stage. So for example, in a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, the effects loop circuitry is actually solid state. So when you plug your preamp into the effects return, there is a solid state return gain stage. And if you set the output of this super hot, you're going to saturate that return stage. And how that return stage saturates, does it sound musical or not, is another thing that may be important. Typically, it's not really an issue because you would run the return stage clean and you'd get all the drive, etc., from the preamp itself. So you don't have to slam the return stage with a really hot signal and worry about whether you're going to overdrive the return stage and thus change the tone of the amp. I'm rambling a lot, and I'm not sure if it's all making sense.
Because I don't know a lot of this stuff. I know like what sounds good, and then how to deal with this on into a basic effects loop. I mean, so for my two rock, I guess it's I don't know if it's I don't even know. It's just a big in and out. It's not really a fancy effects loop. I know that they put in there, um, and I
You
know
I
that.
don't I actually just to be clear, I actually don't know, the two rock circuits well. I don't know if that's actually a buffered loop or a passive loop. I couldn't tell you, so
I think
but if it works
it's a
well,
passive loop. It's a
it's a
passive loop.
passive loop, okay. Yeah.
And what I found nice about at least the two rock and your pedals, especially the juggler, is that you have an attenuated output switch, so I can say
Mhm.
how much output I have going to the amplifier power amp section. Whereas
Yeah.
on the Maiden, when I plugged into the hot rod, it was very touchy on the volume because that volume that the hot rod power amp is wide open. The two rock isn't wide open. You can hear it playing loud, but you can use the master volume on. I'm pointing over here. You can use the master volume on the juggler to set the output of the amplifier, and you also have this cool attenuation switch of 3 different levels that I can push the front end of the amplifier, which is really, really, really helpful.
Right, yeah, yeah. I mean, basically, there's an output switch which gives you modes for full preamp outputs. That's a very
Mhm.
hot signal. And then there's a reduced, like, instrument level preamplifier output. And so if the output of the pedal is or the preamp is too hot, you can use that attenuated level. For example, if you find that it's just too the taper of the master is too finicky and you can't quite set it, it comes on really quickly, then go to the middle output and it'll put you in a nicer place so you've got a better sweep on your master, right?
Right.
And then the third position is an attenuated output, and it's also EQ'd slightly differently to optimize it more for front of amp use. So that would be where you would run the
Okay.
juggler just into the front of your amp, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your pedals aren't solely, as I was going to get into, that the pedal we're talking about, say the juggler, the preamp pedals can also be used into the front of the amplifier as well.
It certainly
And
can, yeah, yeah, and it actually sounds really good that way, but the caveat is, it's all down to what amp you're running it into, because when you run into the front of an amp, well, now your amp already has a preamp in it, right? So
Mhm.
whatever your amp's preamp is doing is coloring the sound in some
Right.
way. So it depends how you like to set that preamp. Do you like the bright switch on? Where do you set the tone controls? Is it a relatively flat sounding preamp or is it really scooped? So all those
Right.
things will enter into it, and of course this is what we're up against when we run any standard overdrive or distortion pedal or fuzz into an amp. That's why a JC120 sounds vastly different running a fuzz into than, say, a Marshall 50-watt plexi, right? It's not just the power amp, it's the preamp that you're running into. And that's
Mhm.
part of that takes us back to what we were talking about before. The nice thing about running into a power amp is you have a flatter frequency response for a more sort of a better building block to
Mhm.
create the sound that you want. When you run into the front end of the amp, it may sound awesome, or you might not like it as much. And that just depends, just like it does with any distortion pedal. It's really the same, right? But part of
Oh,
the nice thing about the preamps is that you can get away from that and you can really hear the nature of the actual preamp into a flatter stage or into a flatter power amp. And that will give you a much better approximation of the amplifier that the preamps are designed after.
so say if you had something like the Power Station, by Fryette, which is a
Mhm.
two power amp, and
Yeah.
how would that be pretty flat response? That would be like an
Yeah.
optimal way to run your pedal?
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, when I say flat, we're not looking for a flat
Right.
response, but flatter, right? It's
Flatter, right.
flatter than your typical front end of an amp. Yeah. The Fryette Power Station actually works really well for running preamps into it. It's a really great sounding power amp. At least I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you have any suggestions for, say, like a solid state power amp, something maybe a little easier to bring around? So if you had a mini board,
Yeah.
have you tried any that you liked?
Yeah. I haven't tried many, but I do have one. I have the Seymour Duncan Power Stage 700,
Mhm.
which is a solid state power amplifier. They've got the pedal board ones as well. I think the PS100, the PS200. I've got
Mhm.
sort of a little mini amp top type unit, which is a stereo power amp, and I've taken that to gigs with preamps before, and it works great. Yeah, it to me, I mean, I don't have other solid state power amps to compare to, but if I compare that to uh, tube power amplifiers that I'm used to, it sounds quite good, but maybe just a little less detail in the top end clarity, a little less You know, now we get down the sort of adjective sort of rabbit hole here, but the less sort of transparency and less of a 3D sound. The Power Station does sound better, although for some people it might be subtle and they might not really mind too much because it's really not a big trade-off.
Sure. It sounds less good.
Less gooder.
Less gooder. Now, okay, let's talk about that for just a second. So, if we're talking about the guys are getting in the weeds now, and I think hopefully you guys will have fun with this. If you're looking at something, say like a two-rock or a Dumble-based design, most of the overdrive comes from the power state, from the preamp section. So you're basically
That's right.
using a big clean power section. So if
Yeah.
you're using, say, something like the Constable, which is based upon a Marshall, which often relies more on the phase inverter and the power amp section as well, what would you suggest in a situation like that if you're going to go that route? If
Yeah.
you want to get a Marshally sound out of a big clean power amp.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That gets a bit more complicated. So if you have a clean power amp and you want it to stay clean, and then you want to introduce something to give you a Marshall type sound, I mean, there's a lot of great distortion pedals out there that do cover those kind of classic Marshall Plexi style sounds. Although for my money, they tend to be overly gainy. They tend to sort of, you know, I think sort of maybe understandably so, the Van Halen's sort of Brown sound is like a benchmark, and everybody wants their Marshall style pedal to be able to do that kind of thing and maybe more, right? But if you actually plug into vintage Marshalls, GHM 45s and super leads and things like that, they're really not that gainy unless you really dime them and have everything else just right, like Van Halen did.
Yeah.
But they sound great, but they're more for me sort of low to medium gain sounds, unless you introduce an overdrive pedal or a fuzz or something. And that's where the
because there's my old super lead there. When I first got it, I was very surprised at how clean they were. I was younger and I got it and I was like, this isn't really very gainy at all.
Yeah. Well, the magic happens when you turn them up, of course, but you know, how often can you do that, right?
Almost never. So in my experience, what I've been doing when I want those Marshally sounds from your pedals, if I was using the Maiden on the road, actually, let me go back to what I was using. I was using your Maiden. This is like this, the Maiden and the Harlot into the Maiden. So the Maiden, we'll talk about your standalone overdrive pedals in a minute.
Yeah.
When I used the Harlot as my overdrive and ran it into this clean. So I had your really beautiful sounding preamp section. So I really could dial it in, which I felt has a much better EQ for me and what I like than the hot rod itself. It's much more articulate, and it felt closer to my two rock. And then when I ran this into it, I liked it sonically much better. My friend Angus Clark I think he's on. I went to his house. We plugged it in right before we went to hit the road. We plugged him in. We started playing. And we both agreed that was really the EQ section of the Maiden just made things sound much more pleasant. There's not some of those spiky frequencies that I find that are pretty inherent in some of the hot rod series. That could be speakers as well, but it took out some of that stuff for me.
Right. Great. Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. Yeah. The Harlot is a good front of amp pedal and will give you, it's not designed after a Marshall sound particularly, but it is more of a British sound. It's got some sizzle and some sort of some bite, you know?
Yeah.
So it's not a super high gain pedal, but it's got a fair amount of aggressiveness in its core tone. So if you want a British style sound, so you can run that into the front end of any amp, or indeed into a preamp, right? Which then goes into a power amp.
Yeah.
But the Constable is actually designed after the actual preamp of a late 60s Marshall 4-input super lead style amplifier.
Great.
And that's really just the same preamp in a box, tubes running at high voltage, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting. I just basically took that basic design and added a master volume afterwards so that you can attenuate the output and then run it into power amps or indeed into the front of an amp, because the Constable also has that little 3-way output switch.
Right.
Now, the thing is, it's a bit of a can of worms, because if you're going for the classic Marshall crunch sound from the 60s and 70s and beyond, that really relies on the preamp pushing the power amplifier. And so if you have, say, a Marshall style preamp like the Constable, and you run it into the effects loop return of an amplifier, there's no guarantee that you're going to get the whole Marshall experience. The Constable itself has a very large output on tap, so it will overdrive the power amplifier, no problem. And it might sound just great. You might have really good results doing that into your 2-rock, for example. But on the other hand, if you have, say, a Hot Rod Deluxe with a solid state effects loop return, well, now you're at the mercy of whatever that does when you drive it really hard with the Constable's hot output, right?
Right.
So in order to get your Hot Rod Deluxe to give up the goods, so to speak, you have to set the Constable really loud, and that will clip the power amplifier, but probably you'll get some clipping from the effects loop return as well. And I don't actually, in all honesty, I don't have a Hot Rod Deluxe to try. I didn't design it with that amp in mind, but
Sure.
I would imagine it's probably not the best way to get the most authentic Marshall tone.
Right.
If you have a passive loop, you would do better with the Constable into a passive loop effects return to get a more authentic tube power amplifier breakup, right?
Okay.
So if you want to get a more Marshally sound and you want more drive than the Constable has within itself, within its own circuit, it has a small amount of drive. If you turn up the volume 1 and volume 2, just like on a plexi amplifier,
Right.
the first gain stage drives the second gain stage, right? And the cathode follower. And those stages will give you some overdrive. And it's a really nice overdrive, actually. It's just not a lot of overdrive. So there's a bit of surprise with some people if they plug into a Constable and they say, wow, this doesn't sound like a gainy Marshall. And that's because the preamp inside a Marshall doesn't have a lot of gain, or at least not in the classic Marshalls we're talking about.
Right.
The gain came more from pushing the power amplifier hard, right?
Okay.
So let's say you've got a Constable and you want to get more of that type of sound. Well, then if you're not going to get it by pushing a power amplifier because of the problems of finding the right power amplifier to drive, and the inherent problems of volume, which will be a problem too, because if you drive your power amplifier hard, it's going to be loud, right? So then you're into attenuation world and things like that. But if you want to get a good Marshall sound out of the Constable and you want more drive, you can actually get excellent results by just pushing the Constable with another pedal. So if you push the front end of the Constable, you can push it with a distortion or an overdrive pedal and it'll sound good. But I think you probably get better results pushing it with a really hot boost, something that has a lot of output, so it can kick the front end. So that's really strong signal will just push the heck out of the tubes in the Constable, right?
Right.
And that actually sounds really good. And then you can attenuate the output with the master on the Constable and still safely drive it into your reverb and delay and into your effects return, even if it's of an active effects loop or something like on a Hot Rod Deluxe.
Right.
So getting a really nice hot output boost. And there's various ones on the market that would work great for that. Yeah.
Sure.
You can also put devices after the Constable. So the Constable will drive something which can then produce that sound. And I've started to make a pedal called the Hatchet, which is actually a tube or valve phase inverter circuit in a pedal.
Okay.
So the Constable can then drive the Hatchet, which produces the same type of overdrive that you would get from that circuitry in the Marshall, which you can then attenuate and add effects and go into your power amp or indeed into the front of an amp. So that's a really good thing too. It's not in our standard range of products right now. It's a custom product. It's called the Hatchet, and you can place it after any preamp, but it works especially well after the Constable to produce a really authentic Marshall style drive tone.
Okay, cool. That's great. This is great info. So what's interesting is, this is then you're really kind of constructing an amplifier at that point.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're taking all the constituent parts, right?
Mhm.
And it's interesting when you do that because you're sort of learning what the different gain stages do, right? You've got your basic preamp, whether that's a 1 or 2 tube design, and there'll be a certain amount of gain inherent in that. And then you can push the front end of it, which will push the first gain stage and cascade on into the other stages. Or you can place a device after your preamp because the preamp has a hot output. So that output will overdrive whatever you place afterwards. So you've got different ways of creating gain, right? And of
Mhm.
course, I mean, all designers know this and they build it into their products, right? It's usually just all in one box, right? And the user doesn't know where exactly that gain's coming from. But basically, what I've tried to do is take those classic amp designs and figure out, well, hopefully what makes them tick and where the drive comes from and how to get those types of tones um, in a modular approach, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. And then the benefit of that is that you can have everything on the floorboard too, which is really nice. So you could fly with that if you know what kind of power amp you have somewhere. That this is the whole point of a lot of this stuff. And my friend Angus Clark, who just was on here, asked if he thinks the SHO would ZVEX SHO work well for boosting the Constable.
Well, the truth is, I don't know.
I would assume it would be.
What's
If
it?
anybody's on the road, the Trans-Siberian Orchestra with that's Angus Clark playing on there. Yeah, so I'm
Awesome.
looking for. Yeah, so anybody check out Angus, of course, angusclark.com.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. What type of pedal is that?
It's like a clean boost by
Yeah.
ZVEX.
Well, if it's a clean boost, I mean, the only thing with clean boosts is clean boosts have different uses, and a lot of clean boosts have a fairly flat frequency response, so they don't cut bass and they don't boost highs. They try to be just a boost, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really useful thing to have. But when you're driving something really hard, it actually helps to cut some of the low end. Because if you have too much of a full frequency response running into something which is going to be driven hard, that's where indistinct bass and mushiness comes out, right? So if you want a tighter tone, you want something which can cut a bit of bass. And there are things like the classic treble booster circuit, for example, right? That makes your guitar signal a lot leaner and focuses the sound more into the mid-range. And that works
Tube
really well
Screamer,
for
yeah,
pushing
too.
something,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, Tube Screamers
Tube Screamer too. The only thing with the Tube Screamer is it's not a clean boost by any stretch of the imagination. So and also it doesn't have much output on tap.
right.
So you can use it to push something, but the output isn't strong enough to really push the front end of what you're pushing.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a bit of drive in the Tube Screamer, right?
Mhm.
And there's the EQ, the inherent mid-range it has. And
Yep.
then there's a sort of, a medium output on tap, which can partially overdrive the front end of your amp.
Yeah.
It's a great pedal, obviously, and it works great for all sorts of applications. But for the application I'm talking about, where we're wanting to keep the dynamic range and the top end sizzle of that classic Marshall circuit, I think something with less mid range or less of a mid range hump and less top end and low end roll off actually works a bit better. Yeah, a clean boost which can cut the bass. A graphic EQ can work really well. You can just take out some of the low frequencies there and use it as a boost pedal. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if your boost pedal has a really hot output, that's the best. In fact, what you can even do is you can take another preamp and cascade it into the Constable. So you could take like a Maiden, believe it or not. I mean, it's kind of overkill, but you could take this and you could cascade it into a Constable, and this has a massive output, and this will really drive the Constable hard.
Right, and you've got the EQ on the Maiden so that you could work it. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, it's overkill. You would probably want to. The trouble with doing that is that if you set this up for that, well, you're going to lose the optimal settings for the Maiden clean tone. So I don't generally suggest that that's the best thing to buy this for. Yeah. A simple pedal like a little one knob boost like this would do really well. This is actually a little circuit I've been messing with. It's called the Brute. It's not sort of on my site yet. It's a custom product, but it's a solid state boost. But it runs at a high voltage and it's got a lot of output. So this will kick the front end of your amp or a Constable really nicely. It's a JFET boost, and it's got a little 3-way switch for different amounts of low end. And the third mode has super hot output and a bit of a mid-range kick. So something like that, something not necessarily this one, but a boost with a little bit of EQ control and a hot output. Yeah.
I end up using quite a bit. I end up using the Klon, and then it's got a gain. I use a lot of the front end and then the treble control. And then I can dial in if I want some of the gain, which I know people are like, oh, you shouldn't use it as a clean boost. But basically, how I use a Klon a lot of times is a clean boost with the treble control. So that really helps quite a bit.
Sure.
Okay, other things I want to cover, because I love talking about this stuff, is there's a lot of pedals out there that call themselves preamp pedals, but they're actually not preamp pedals, which I think is an interesting thing you want to be careful with. like overdrives that call themselves a preamp, and then they're not actually a preamp. They're just an overdrive pedal. They may be a great overdrive pedal, but they're not actually a preamp pedal. And one
Well,
thing that I love about your pedals, that they sound great, obviously, is that you are running the tubes at really high voltage. Can you talk about that a little bit?
yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, can I just make a comment on the preamp thing?
Please. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, a preamp is actually just anything which boosts your voltage, right?
Yeah.
So, if you think if your guitar puts out, say, a volt peak to peak or something, anything that can raise that up to a higher voltage is
Mhm.
amplifying that voltage. It's therefore a preamplifier.
Right.
Okay. And preamplifiers are in all sorts of audio gear, mixing boards and amplifiers and effects pedals and delay pedals and reverbs and everything. They're all over the place, right? Because whenever you do something to the sound, you usually need some way of it's usually subtractive. You're usually taking something away, and you need some way of bringing the signal back up.
Mhm.
And that's what preamplifier stages are for. And they can be transistor, they can be IC chips, or they can be tube based, right? So
Mhm.
really, a preamp. I mean, anybody can put the preamp label on a pedal, but what I tend to do is I reserve that label for the types of preamp which are found in a guitar amplifier. So the
Mhm.
classic preamplifier of a Fender Tweed amp or a Marshall Plexi or a Dumble ODS, the actual circuitry which is in a guitar amplifier, which has a large part of the tonal sculpting of your signal. I call those preamps for our products.
Mhm.
And so generally, if it says preamp on the pedal, that would tend to mean that that pedal can be used to replace what your amplifier preamp is already doing. So it can drive a power amp to full output
Mhm.
and hopefully sound good for the guitar.
Yeah.
Other manufacturers may use that term differently, right? But I just use preamplifier for those types of pedals. Not like pedals which I don't use the preamp label for would be like the Harlot,
Mhm.
or the Page, or the Minstrel, or the Jester. Those pedals are front of amp pedals, and anything that's front of amp, I just don't bother using the preamp label for. So they are in, like many other pedals, they are in fact preamps, but I don't
Mhm.
like to confuse them with the other preamps, because if you took, say, a Harlot or a Page and you ran it into your effects return to try to access the power amp, it just wouldn't sound very good. It doesn't have, it might not have enough output to drive your amp to full output, and it
Mhm.
would also shave off too much top end, and it would sound dull and lifeless.
Right.
So the preamps that we make are more, yeah, they're basically the preamps that you would find in classic amplifiers. Yeah. So anyway,
Cool.
that rambling about preamplifiers.
No, but that's
But,
the perfect definitions. I
yeah,
would
yeah,
expect
it's
no
common
less
on
from you.
boost pedals. A lot of
Yeah.
people call their boost pedals preamplifier, right? And they are
Yeah.
preamplifiers, right? But just so
Right.
as long as you understand, something that's designed to go front of amp doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work as a preamp effectively into your power amplifier. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
May or may not, right? There's no sort of rule there. But
So
yeah, so preamps. What was the other thing you were talking about? Oh yeah, high voltage, right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
tube
the voltage
circuits.
of the tubes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, tubes are high voltage devices generally, right? So they work better at high voltages.
Mhm.
And I mean, the reason I bothered using tubes and pedals is just because I was making amps, and that's what I knew. I knew tube amps, and I knew the tube preamplifiers inside those amps, and they all, of course, run at high voltage, because otherwise they don't tend to sound very good. So there are ways of running tubes at lower voltage,
Mhm.
and you can certainly, for overdrive, you can use a starved plate design where the voltage is a lot lower, and you can still make the tube overdrive, and it might sound really good. But in general, where you'll tend to be lacking is in dynamic range and clarity,
Mhm.
openness. So it's easier. You don't have to work as hard when you run them at high voltage. I mean, run them at the voltage they were designed for, and they're going to sound better. And they do have hot outputs,
Mhm.
but like I say, the reason they have hot outputs is because I want to be able to drive power amps just in the same way that the preamplifier in an amplifier drives a power amp.
Yeah, it makes
The
perfect sense.
front of amp pedals, like the Harlot and the Page and the Jester, they have reduced output. So those pedals have an output more in line with any typical overdrive or distortion pedal. They may or
Right.
may not be a bit hotter, but you want to be able to get your same level as your clean signal and then some level of boost, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
So the
Well,
fact
I
that the
love that
pedals
because
are
they're
running at
very.
high voltage doesn't impact that. It's not the high voltage which makes it. Having a high voltage circuit enables you to get a very high output, but it
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean that your pedal has a high output. I mean, it's easy to attenuate the output of any preamplifier.
Sure.
Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, but no, it's okay. I love it because this is your thing. You're passionate about. You know way more about it than I do. I just love the way they feel when I play your pedals. They clean up great. They're really touch sensitive when you play. They feel like I'm playing an amplifier. And there's some great solid state pedals, and I'm a big fan of them, and I use them in conjunction with your two overdrives. And I think that the two of them often work very well together. You just find the pedals that you like. It's just about what it is. But I found, as I was saying in the beginning of the whole show, and I want to get some questions here, is uh, what I love about the pedals in a very simple sort of way was I am used to playing this two rock platform or a Dumble style platform where it's a very clean power section, and most of my overdrive is really sort of coming from either a pedal if I want in front of the amplifier, and or from the preamp section of an amplifier. So it's like a two rock. So when I got the juggler, that was really just does it for me when I want to go travel. I can have the sound on my board. I'm very comfortable with it. Um, does it sound as good as the amp? Well, I'm not running probably into the same power section, so
Yeah.
maybe not. But what it sounds really, really as good as I can get it. It's been the happiest I've been in a situation where I don't actually have my amplifiers. And even when
Yeah.
I run my two rocks live, I very often run them clean and I use your Harlot and other pedals in front of it because then I can control the volume all from the floor and I have to worry
Yeah.
about getting four cable method if I want delay and overdrive and reverb. So it's been really a lot of fun to get into your pedals because I find they're really, really, really useful in a really
Awesome. Well,
practical way.
yeah, great. That's great. Yeah. The use of the preamps on the road for guys who use backline is kind of like I didn't sort of start making them necessarily for that purpose, but
Mhm.
they certainly work well for that, and that's definitely a good thing to think about if you use a lot of backline amps. Now, sometimes backline amps, of course, I mean, you may not get an amp with an effects loop, right? So
Mhm.
it might not necessarily help you, right?
No,
Um,
right.
but if you do get any choice in the matter, you can choose like a Hot Rod Deluxe or DeVille or something like that. Then that's a
Yeah.
way at least you can sort of go, well, at least I know what I'm getting there, and then I can take the preamp that I know and run into the effects return and feel a little bit more comfortable that you're going to be getting the sounds that you expect.
That's my primary goal on the road because you never know when you got to rent an amp, what you're gonna get. And I remember years I was playing Marshalls for many years. I still love Marshalls, but you rent a Marshall on the road. You put in I would like at the time either an 800 or like a Plexi or JT, a JMP or something like that, and you get a Marshall 2000 or
Right.
in
Right.
which is not the same amplifier. And it was really, really
Right.
frustrating because you couldn't get. So I started going to the point where I want all my sound on my pedal and have a really great clean platform behind me. Then I started running into some of those problems of the hot rods having certain frequencies, or the more you play and the spoiled you get playing really nice gear,
Yeah.
the touch sensitivity isn't there. So I was overjoyed to have your pedal on the floor, plug it into the effects return and go, this sounds pretty darn good. I can do a whole gig in this and feel really confident that I'm taking my sound with me and I know what's going to be there. So I think
Cool.
it's great.
Awesome. Well,
Um,
that's great. That's good to hear, Jeff.
oh no, totally. I got some questions.
Sure.
Let me go back here. Sorry, all right, guys, we were just blabbing. So, okay. There you go. Where's the best place to get one of these pedals? You only do direct. Am I correct? Right?
Yeah, I mean, we actually only sell direct. You can contact us, kingsleyamplifiers.com, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and just shoot us an email. And we do have a little bit of a waiting list, but it's actually not bad that right now it's a couple of months for most pedals.
Mm-hmm.
And some pedals are a lot longer because there's more demand for them, like the juggler. That's a bit of
Okay.
a long wait. It's about 10 months to a year right now.
Wow.
But
Jeez.
most
They
of
are
them
going
are a couple of
twice
months.
the price on the open market. Like you go to Reverb and they're like twice the price.
Well, I don't know if they're actually selling them for that much, but
No, they're a lot.
you
They're
know,
more. They're significantly more. Yeah.
yeah. Well, they don't need to really be, especially as the wait's not too bad for most of them now. In 2 months or less, we can usually get them out of here. So yeah, just contact us at Kingsley Amplifiers, and we
Yeah.
can help you out.
And you're in British Columbia. Someone's asking if you're in
Yeah,
England. You're in
that's right.
British
Yeah,
Columbia.
just outside of Vancouver. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Um, Let me see what we got going. And we got James Redmond's in here today, which is great. He's also in Canada. James, great teacher and a great website and a friend of mine. So maybe
Cool.
you guys are both in Canada. You should connect for sure.
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
Someone's asking,
Awesome.
okay, basic question. What's the inspiration for the pedal names? Medieval theme?
Oh, yeah. The pedal names. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse, when you've got a theme, but yeah, it's sort of, I didn't know what to call the pedals and the amp, so we chose Kingsley just because that's actually my middle name.
Oh, okay.
So the products were called Kingsley, and then we went, well, we ended up just choosing a couple of names that were sort of based upon the sort of medieval or historic kind of European theme. So we had,
Mm-hmm.
things like the jester and the juggler and the jouster and the squire and the page. So you can just go down this rabbit hole. And I mean, the constable doesn't sound like it's very old, but actually constables do go back a fair way, I think,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, whenever there's a new product, we have to come up with a new name, and that can be challenging.
Can you see that question on there on your screen?
Yeah. What's the best one to get the Dumble sound? Well, I mean, I hesitate to say that any pedal will give you the Dumble sound, but we do make a couple of different preamps based upon the Dumble preamplifier.
Yeah.
And they would be the Squire, the Maiden, and the Juggler. So the Squire is a simplified version. This is a Squire, although this is a Squire 86. But the Squire D has 3 controls: volume, treble, and bass, and it's a really simplified version of the Dumble ODS clean channel. And this does everything that the Maiden does with just less knobs and features.
Okay.
So if you want a simple way to get a great clean platform, then the Squire is a great way to go. After that, the Maiden D, which you have, Jeff, and that's more full featured with treble, middle, bass, and volume and master and mid boost and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, if you want the Dumble ODS overdrive channel as well, then either you get the Juggler, or if you have a Squire or a Maiden, you get something called the Page DS. And just a quick word about the thing with the Dumble ODS style preamp is its design architecture goes basically your guitar hits the clean preamp first, and then if you have an actual ODS amp, when you turn on the overdrive channel, that clean channel is still active and it's going into an overdrive stage. It's cascading into another valve or another tube, right? Which gets driven by the clean channel, right? So if you have a pedal which does Dumble or American style clean channel, you can do the same thing if you duplicate that other tube gain stage inside the Dumble ODS circuitry. So clean channel into overdrive channel. So you can get those 2 pedals, and that would give you the right kind of sound, or the Dumble ODS inspired sound. Or we make one which has it all in one box, and that's the Juggler.
Right.
Right.
In my experience, it all depends on what, but the Juggler kind of does all that, and that's why I wanted it all in one pedal with all the options of being front of the amplifier or into the power section, and kind of in between too, the different volume levels. So if you're going to go for one, I would recommend, if you want the full-on experience of the Dumble style thing, I would recommend the Juggler all in one pedal with all the bells and whistles.
Yeah.
And then you're good. You're as close as you're going to get until you start moving up to something like a Two Rock or a Dumble,
or an actual amplifier, an actual ODS style build. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've made quite a lot of ODS style amps over the years as well. And so that's how I kind of got started on making the ODS style pedals. And I mean, the Juggler has a couple of advantages over the separate pedals. Like Jeff mentioned already, you get various features which can be handy, like the output switch, which enables you to run into a power amp or into the front of an amp. You've got a global master for both channels, so you can set the individual levels and then have a global master to bring the whole thing up and down. And you've also got the 3rd foot switch on there, which can function as an EQ lift or a mid boost. And it's also got remote switching capability. So if you have like a switching rig or a MIDI rig or something, the Juggler doesn't have MIDI, but if you have, say, like a gig rig style switcher, or who are the other companies, RJM or Musicom Lab, and you've got your pedals in a switcher and you want to be able to coincide the turning on of the pedal with the overdrive or with the mid boost. You can do all that via the remote switches on Juggler. So it's quite full featured that way. Yeah.
That would be, I mean, I mean, I don't think the pedal, they're not inexpensive, but I don't think for what you're getting, they're really, I mean, they're handmade pedals. They look like if you ever open them up, they're beautifully made, gonna last a lifetime. It's not like I'm trying to a commercial here, but I love this stuff. I'm overjoyed
Yeah.
that
Oh,
I
thanks.
can
Yeah.
say to someone like, oh, you can't afford a 2-rock, but I got a good amp with a good preamp section. This is the way to go. And then you have those options. You can use it or not use it. It's full featured. So I think they're really great. And someone just asked, this is another great question. Once again, this is we can talk. This is deep, but Wayne, can you run a Juggler directly into the audio interface for recording?
Yeah.
You would have to have a power amp section and, of course, an IR speaker IR. So there,
I mean, all you really need is, I mean, you won't, if you plug straight into your audio interface, you're missing the power amplifier, of course, but it will sound very good without a power amplifier as long as you have a good cabinet simulator.
Right.
So if you have a good cab sim, like say the 2 Notes Cab M, or there's so many on the market these days, I don't know them all. You can actually get good results.
Yeah, there's all sorts of great ones. Yeah.
Yeah, as long so you can run straight into your audio interface, and it might be that your software you're using has a good cabinet simulation within it.
And by the way, guys,
In
if you have something like a Pod XT or an HX Stomp or anything like that, you could run the pedal, the Juggler out into one of those and use their cabinet emulation and then run that into your. So it doesn't have to be crazy. You could run it. You could run into. I have an Axe Effects on the floor. I could just run that, take out the amplifier block and leave the cabinet block. And so those are things that you could also do on your HX Stomp or. So there's lots of ways around it. If you don't have a separate IR loader, if you have something, anything by line 6 will do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you're still missing the power amplifier, but and it's I don't want to minimize what a nice tube amp power amp does, obviously, sure. but because the Dumble ODS preamplifier generates its overdrive within the preamp, there's a lot going on in the preamp already. So even without a power amplifier, you can still get nice tones for recording. My preference is still to run through a tube power amp, obviously, if you can.
Of course, yeah, sure. Yeah. And here's my buddy Michael Copes. He's saying, quite an education day. What a treat. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for being here. Thanks for everybody being here.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, appreciate that.
And what's more questions? We've been on for a while. I know we talked a lot, and I usually field more questions. I want to say hi to everybody. I got a little flustered at the beginning, which I'm going to edit out when we get back in. So unfortunately, you lose all the chat, but I don't want anybody to sit through 10 minutes of me panicking and trying to get sound out of everything. But hey, I did, it's kind of crazy how this works or does not work. But Steve Moore, Mike Burrell, everyone, Jason Carter, everybody who's here as always. And of course, BV Ninja for as always doing that pedal show and doing my stuff. And
right, yeah. Well, I keep hearing his name all the time on so many different live streams and YouTube shows. It's a popular guy.
Yeah, he's the man, and he knows a ton, which is really helpful because I'm like, hey, even with Keith and I over at 5 Watt World, he's like, Beaver, can you answer that question? And suddenly up comes the perfect answer and all this kind of stuff.
And guy to know. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, let me see if there are other questions. Got some new messages down here. All right. Okay, we got another question from. What's the best Kingsley pedal to drive a Plexi style amp and the Constable? Simon, take a stab at that, maybe?
A couple of thoughts come to mind. One is a pedal I have called the Peasant. And the Peasant is a very simple tube boost pedal. It's got one gain stage and a cathode follower. And it has an input impedance control, just 2 knobs, input impedance or Z and volume. So it's got plenty of output to push the preamp in your amp or to push the Constable. And the input impedance knob is nice because as you rotate it counterclockwise, it rolls off low end in a nice smooth way. So you can lean out the bottom end as much as you need. It also interacts directly with your pickups and your electronics in your guitar if you put it first in line. In a similar way that, for example, a treble booster does. It's not a treble booster circuit, but that when you turn the input impedance down low, Uh, that's what a treble booster has. It has a very low input impedance, and that makes the interaction with the guitar really interesting. So when you turn down your volume with the treble booster up front, you get good cleanup, right?
It's like a
So
fuzz.
it's the
Yeah.
same on the Peasant. It can improve your cleanup if as you turn that Z knob down and boost the front end and lean out the low end if you want it to. So that's a really good pedal for a few different reasons. It's just a nice simple boost. So of our pedals, I would probably look at that one first. Another one you could look at would be the Page.
Mhm.
But the Page is sort of its forte, I think, is very mild edge of breakup tones,
It's
and
beautiful sounding.
it does those great into a clean amp or into a mildly overdriven amp. You know, if you're going into, like with anything, when you're cascading pedals or gain stages, it all depends on where the gain's coming from and how much you put where and when is it too much. But if you've got an amp which is heavily overdriven, I think
Mhm.
the Peasant will work better. The Page might, the combination might be too much, get too saturated, unless you run the gain on the Page very low. But if you've got a mildly overdriven amp, or you're using the Constable for mild drive, the Page is actually nice for kicking the front end. That works quite well as well. And actually better than the Page is the Page TS, which I think you have there,
It's my friend
Jeff.
Jess. It's not mine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not yours, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
saw
It's
it
one
on
we
the
have
floor.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there it is. Yeah. Yeah, so that one actually, because it's got more EQ control,
Mhm.
you can get a bit more clarity and top end, which can be good when you're pushing something hard. Yeah, so
Now,
those three might be good. Yeah.
now I have as you can see here, I have the Harlot is mine, and I have a Minstrel which is actually in the mail coming from you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so now do I need a
Cool.
Peasant too? Is it?
Now, you don't need anything. I mean, but you know, the Peasant is cool for, yeah, guys trying to push the front end of the ramp. You know,
Okay.
in fact, you can push other pedals with it. It's just a great pedal for pushing other things, so that those things can give up the goods more readily, with a little bit of ability to sculpt the low end. It's kind of a nice pedal. Yeah,
Thanks, yeah, Robert. Thanks. Interesting stream. Well, we're having fun.
appreciate that.
I love talking about this stuff. Now I got a quick question for you as well. Buffers. So when you run, or okay, I usually run a buffer at the end of my chain, and sometimes at the
Mhm.
beginning. And the buffer is, never before fuzz, blah blah blah. So
Yeah.
if I'm running into the power amp section, there's enough output from. I don't need a buffer between your pedal and the effects loop, correct?
Yes, in general you don't, but it depends on a couple of things.
Okay. Of course it
Most
does.
of our Yeah, without going down another rabbit hole too
Mhm.
much, a buffer basically lowers the output impedance so that you can drive long cable runs, right?
Mhm.
And effectively drive other devices without losing signal strength, right? Or losing
Right.
top end, right? So the Juggler has a built-in buffer circuit, so you're good there. The Maiden does not have that built-in buffer circuit,
Okay.
so its output impedance is actually relatively high.
Got it.
It's still not so high that it doesn't work into most devices very well. But here's a little tip. For example, if you're running, let's say you have a Fryette power station, um, the line input on that expects to see expects to be driven by a lower impedance. So if you were to plug a Constable or a Maiden into the line input on the Fryette power station, it wouldn't sound very good. You lose all body and you get a weak signal, because the output impedance of the Constable and the Maiden are relatively high compared to most pedals.
Okay.
But there's an easy way around that. You just run into the effects return on the Fryette power station and you're golden. It's all good. Because I guess the effects loop return on the Fryette has a higher input impedance, so it works well. But in general, most effects returns and most other pedals and amplifiers tend to have input impedances of around 1 mega ohm or maybe 500k sometimes. But
Mhm.
so as long as you've got something in that range, then there's no problem driving them with with any of our preamps. A couple of our preamps have built-in buffers, but a lot of them don't.
Mhm.
If there is ever an issue, if you're driving like a ridiculously long cable or something, you notice a little bit of top end roll off. What you can do is you can put any pedal that you may already have after the preamp to buffer the signal. So if
Yeah.
you're going to run reverb or delay after your maiden, well, that reverb or delay will also buffer the signal so that you can drive long cable runs. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In general, it's a non-issue because it's not enough of a mismatch but there are the odd case where you might run into something like with the Fryette power station or like with other devices which have a line input. Quite often the
Gotcha.
line input expects a different impedance than what some of our preamps put out.
Excuse me. Yeah, I never noticed anything that made me go, "Oh, that doesn't sound good." So it's good. Some more questions. We got Ken Volpe. What's up, man? Ken in a long time. Love the juggler. What two power amps do you like to run the juggler into?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't. Most of the time, I just run into the effects returns of a couple of my own amps
Okay.
because I make amps. So I've got amps with effects loops and both buffered loops and passive loops. But I also have a Fryette power station, and it works great into that. I also have the Seymour Duncan PS700. It works great into that.
Mhm.
But I would say, I mean, and I've used it on the pedal show into the loop return of the Defender Hot Rod Deluxe, I
Mhm.
think it was, or was it a
Yep.
DeVille? I can't remember. But
Either.
it'll work. It'll work. Honestly, it works well into a variety of power amplifiers.
Mhm.
I think if you're going down, if you want a dedicated power amp, and you're not wanting to run into, say, the effects loop return, then you have less choice. There used to be more companies making tube power amps back in the
Right.
80s and the 90s when the rack thing was bigger. But I would look at Fryette or see if you can pick up a used Boogie power amp or a used Marshall power amp. I don't think they make
Mhm.
those anymore either. There was a bunch on the market that you used to be able to get, right? But
Yeah, the
not
tube
so
ones. Yeah,
readily
yeah.
anymore. There is actually there's a who is it? KSR. There's a company which makes great amps and pedals called KSR, and
Okay.
they make some cool little, fairly small um, tube power amplifiers that look really cool. I haven't tried them, but I've got quite a few
Interesting.
customers who have told me that they've used them very successfully with our preamp pedals. So look at KSR amps.
Because when I think about these things, if you could travel with some of these things, like you got your pedal board, and if you maybe have a little tube power amp, like those things are easier sometimes than lugging around the big amp. That's a lot in terms of
Well, if you can get a
what do
small
you
power
do?
amp, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, but if it's going to be small, it's probably going to be if it's going to have any headroom, it's probably going to end up being solid state. But
Yeah.
you know,
Which
there's various solid state ones in the market which probably sound great too. Like I know Orange make one, which I've heard
Mhm.
good things about, but haven't tried. Quilter makes a bunch of small solid state
Sure.
amps, and I think power amps too. There's probably some other
You're playing
ones.
into a deluxe, a F deluxe, whatever that is, Fender deluxe, whatever which one it was. But if you want a really great rundown of the juggler, I bought the juggler, and having two rocks, I was familiar with it. But when I watched your video that you did over that pedal shoot, you went through every
Right,
function and every sound, and for me, it
right.
was like, oh, that's what I'm doing wrong, or understanding. There's a few functions that you have a boost switch, it's a mid or the EQ
Yeah.
lift. So if you watch that video, if you purchase the pedal, or go watch that version, that episode of that pedal show, and it really is a beautiful rundown of the sound of this pedal. That's actually what made me buy it. It was I saw that I'm like,
Okay.
that's
Cool.
it. No, I bought it
Right
from
on.
ahead of time, but because we talked about it, and I saw it, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I bought that pedal. So it really
Right on.
helped me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's got a lot of it's quite full featured, so it can be a little intimidating if you're used to
Yeah.
sort of, volume, treble, bass, go,
Mhm.
There's a few more things to think about there, but it's not that bad once you read about it and dive in and start experimenting.
Yeah.
Yo,
Keith late to the party.
hi Keith, how you doing? Had a nice chat with Keith. Thanks to you, Jeff. You introduced
Oh,
us and had a
sure.
nice phone chat with him not so long ago. So yeah, I hope to chat with him again. But yeah, I really enjoy all his videos he puts out. And in fact, that that's how I learned about you first, Jeff. Right? Was
Oh, really?
through a 5 Watt World because I watched the show, right?
Right.
And yeah, so I kept seeing this guy playing these awesome licks and stuff, and also in various styles. And I was like, who the heck is that?
Yeah.
And there
Cool.
you are. It's
Thanks.
this guy called Jeff McAlane, and he's a very nice guitar player.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did Robin ever get one? Because I hooked you up with Robin about getting the juggler, but
Oh, Robin?
yeah. Did
Yeah,
did
yeah, yeah, Robin Ford. Yeah, no, I did get one to him.
okay.
I'm waiting to hear back from him. We were over
Not
in
unusual.
France actually
Mhm.
over the summer, and he lives in Paris now, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you put me in touch with him too, and that was really nice. And I had a little chat with him, and he received it in the mail, and he phoned me while I was shopping in Worthing, which is a small seaside town in the south of England,
Hmm.
and to tell me that he'd received it, and
Okay.
it was kind of nice to have a chat with him because I'd never talked to him before that. And anyway, yeah, so I kind of gave him a quick kind of rundown of what to expect and how to use it. I think he was getting pretty busy because he was off pretty quickly to on that
Yeah.
tour with Clapton, right?
You did a few
Uh,
gigs. Yeah, a few gigs with Clapton. Yeah, you know.
and I think one thing he did say is he wasn't sure if he's gonna be able to make it work in terms of its size and his pedal board and the challenges of,
Right.
taking a small pedal board that he can sort of fit in the overheads when he goes flying and stuff like that.
And some of the questions
So
that why I'd said to him too is because he's been doing some sessions. I'm like, well, if you can't get your amp there and you know what's there, you have it maybe a little easier, something you're comfortable with. But
yeah, honestly, anything if I could help him out in any way to help him dial it in. I mean, I've honestly, I haven't heard back from him for a little while, so I'm not sure if he's using it or enjoying it or not. I hope he is.
yeah, I'll find out.
Yeah, no
I'll give him a
worries,
hard
no
time.
worries. Yes.
So Keith is asking, do you still build and sell amplifiers? Great question.
I mean, in theory, I do, but I haven't actually honestly made any for quite a few years now. What happened is I was making amps, all amps basically, and then I started to make pedals, and for a while I was making them both, and now we just make pedals. But I can't get myself to take the amps off the website because I kind of want to make some more.
Sure.
And it's kind of nice to make amps. It's a different thing and a different sense of accomplishment when you make one. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So I'm not writing them off. I would like to make them again. And I do have people expressing interest all the time. And I have a pretty long list actually of guys who would like me to make amps. So,
Hmm.
I'm seeing what I can do. And hopefully down the road, I'll figure out a way to make it happen without sort of, going insane.
Yeah.
Because the business is already like really, really busy, and
Sure.
it's just a question of how you want your life to be and
Yeah.
where you put your time and effort into. And it would be great to start amps again and get some more help to do that. But it's sort of like I'm a little hesitant to sort of dive in head first and make life go more crazy than it already is. So I'm trying to figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah. As we were saying, Keith saying one of the reasons why your amp sounds so amazing is your deep knowledge of the different different amplifier topology, which is absolutely
Well,
true. We talked about that a little earlier. Had you been here earlier, Keith, you would have known that.
well, actually, I mean, honestly, I mean, I make the designs that I come up with are all based off amplifier world. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing amazing about it really. If you make amps and if you know how to design a basic tube amp, it's not a big stretch to say, well, how can I put that in a pedal and how can I get some of that into a pedal, and what is it about the dynamic range and stuff and this touch sensitivity, how can that translate in a pedal form?
Yeah.
But a lot of guys are far smarter than me with pedal design. Like I don't know much at all about digital circuits, and a lot of analog electronics is not my forte. So I'm just
Hmm.
kind of like more of an old school guy who figured out how to put some of that amp stuff in small boxes that we can step on.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, what amps do you use to benchmark to dial in the pedals when designing your platform?
I mean, honestly, I these days I test them through a couple. Basically, if I'm making preamplifiers, I test them through a couple of different power amplifiers that I have.
Mhm.
They're either my own power amplifiers. I usually run through a 100-watt 6L6 based power amplifier, which would be similar to an American style power amp. Probably not too far removed from the style of power amp that you'd find in a Fender Twin or a Dumble ODS style or a Two
Mhm.
Rock style power amp. And then that's a good clean platform for testing our preamplifier pedals. At the same time, I run through a Neil 84 30-watt power amp,
Mhm.
cathode bias, non-negative feedback, so more of a Vox AC30 style power amp.
Mhm.
And then I also have some small 1-watt power amps, which I use called the Crucible, which is a little tiny power amp that we build still. That's the one amp that I am still building. It's just a
Okay.
little 1-watt power amp, which is kind of fun. And then if I'm testing other pedals for front of amp applications, like the Harlow or the Page, well, they typically just cascade into one of my preamps. So if I want to test it into a Fender platform, I'll usually run it into, say, a Maiden BF, or if I want to run it into a Marshall Plexi style platform, I'll run it into a Constable, right?
Mhm.
So I've got different preamps on the floor, which I use to sort of access these different types of core tone, which I can then test my pedals into.
Right.
So in a way, what I'm not doing is I don't have like a Fender Twin and a Marshall Plexi and an AC30. Well, I do have AC30s here, but I don't generally use them for testing pedals. I basically have a rig, a stereo rig, and a couple of different power amp options and our pedals. So that's usually what I use for testing, for better or worse.
And once again, you go to Simon's website. I'm sorry. Well, you go also to his YouTube page. You go through all your pedals in the pedal platter, and you give some great lessons on there too. So don't forget, everybody, if you're just tuning in, Simon is a great guitar player. Does some teaching on there too, which is really fun. But here we go through all the different pedals and all the different sounds. Yeah, and you don't just make a tremolo pedal, right? Correct? You make a few.
Yeah, the bar tremolo. Yeah. I've got a design that I'm trying to get finished up, but that's not seen the light of day yet. But the prototype sounds real nice, and it's a tube-driven reverb.
Oh boy!
And so that's hopefully upcoming. It's basically I've put it in a pedal this size, like in a Constable style box, but with an external spring reverb tank. So it's a tube-driven circuit where the tank is external. So what I do on my pedal board is the tank's underneath the board.
Wow.
Because the tank's not very high, right? And my board has a bit of an angle, so I can just slip the tank underneath there. Yep. I'm not 100% decided on whether it's going to keep that sort of design in terms of like a pedal-sized box and then an external tank. The advantage of that, of course, is that, you know, the pedal can be smaller, right?
Sure.
But the limitation is, well, do you want to have an external reverb tank hanging around? Where are you going to put it? Can you put it under your board, or what are you going to do with it, right? So I may go down that route. What I'm probably not going to do is build a pedal with a reverb tank in it, because then they just get absolutely huge. I mean, that's fine, you know, but I think if I end up doing it all in one housing, I'll probably make a small amp top box style reverb.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
So that one hopefully will see the light of day at some point. And that's on a lot of the stuff I do and all my pedal platter videos and teaching videos. That's the reverb you're hearing.
Yeah.
And then I've got a few other projects that I'm sort of, you know, jumping on the bit to get to, like a harmonic tremolo, stuff like that, because the Bard is a cathode, but is a bias modulating tremolo. But it'd be fun to do a harmonic tremolo too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. So lots of great stuff coming in.
Yeah.
Here's Keith firing back that he was making the new video, his latest video coming up with the some expletives there. But we have one thing. Someone was asking about how many preamp pedals do you run. I have an Over Ethos, Humboldt, Green Machine, two wheel Drew. Wow, you have them all on at once. That's got to probably be a lot of stacking.
Yeah, that's a lot all at once. I'm not. Well, there's a question mark at the end there, so I'm not sure if he's saying,
should I run them all?
Can you have them all on at once, or what?
Previous question. Sorry, man.
What I tend to do with preamps is, if you've only got a couple of them, you can put them in series, and then you can turn them on and off as you need them, just as you would with any pedals, right?
Yeah, different sounds.
What I do is I have a switcher. I have one of those gig rig switchers, a G3, and so I have my different preamps in different loops, right? So it's not that like I have a whole bunch of preamps cascaded. It's just one at a time, right?
Yeah. You choose from that. Yeah. Well, man, thanks. It's been an hour and 20 minutes.
Oh wow!
First 10 minutes of insanity when I started playing guitar years and years ago, and I started doing I never thought I'd be running AV and audio video and getting everything right.
You become like a sort of digital electronics master with all this new technology and stuff. You needed a degree in it or something these days. I'm not bad at figuring stuff out, at least I thought I was, until about 20 years ago, when I discovered that I didn't even know how to plug my TV in anymore. Like even just to sort of hook up your TV and stuff, it's always got, every time you get a new device from the store, it's got different connectors and different style plugs, and
Oh, I know.
and then you want to sort of put a different program on your computer and it's not supported, and you have to update your software, and you update your software, and then the other program you had before doesn't work anymore.
Oh, I know,
And
all
so
the
it's
drivers and
it's
that.
like,
Oh,
it moves at a million miles an hour, and so luckily I've got a son who's pretty good at that stuff. So
the,
that's what I do.
that's the crazy thing that happened here on this program. I'm using something called Restream, which is really quite good. But I'm running everything through a third-party app that runs all the audio, mixes it all together, so I can have everything coming out of these. So it's all very complicated. And if one thing in the chain decides to go, I didn't like that, and because I switched something, like turned off noise cancellation, and suddenly the sound just went away. So
Yeah.
it somewhere along something's like, no, I didn't like that you did that, and then it just stopped working. And then and then also, just so you guys understand what was happening in the beginning, which of course I won't go too deep into, if I shut down this stream, then the initial stream link that I sent out will no longer work. So you guys have to go back to the website, the YouTube page, and try to find the next stream that's up, and then rejoin that one. So it's kind of like a one shot. You get it, and if it works, great, awesome. If it doesn't work, great. Then
Yeah.
And I don't have anybody behind there.
Well, you got it figured out though, so that was
Oh yeah,
great.
we worked it out. It was fun, but the only thing over there is a wall. Like I don't have a crew of people helping me. It's just me. So
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But
yeah.
well, I want to thank everybody for being here. Oh, I had a quick question. Someone was asking about my blues boot camp. That was Brazil Rocks. Was the level going on at the blues? It's kind of like early intermediate to intermediate. I think I really want to firm up people's fundamentals and give you actual things to practice to get your blues playing together. It's really designed for people who've been playing forever. And you feel like you're playing the same thing over and over again. You don't feel like you're getting any better. And I break down teaching into 3 ways. I think it's really important to get your repertoire together, learning tunes, really getting that together, working on your technique. And then thirdly is your vocabulary, building up your phrasing, not so much licks, because you're like, right, licks are licks, but it's more about the idea behind them and the musical phrase that you end up building and creating your own ideas from. But thanks to everybody. The boot camp is sold out for this. This is pretty great.
Oh,
so
good
thanks
for
for
you.
everybody who
Good for you.
signed up
No
for
room
that.
for me.
You
join.
don't even need to be it. I would just let you teach it.
No, oh yeah, right. Give me a break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But once again,
Hey,
thanks,
Jeff,
man. Thanks so much for being here. Oh,
next time, if we ever do something like this again, Jeff, we'll have to talk a little bit about guitars and Strats and stuff, because I know that you know lots about them, obviously, and you've got very fine guitars.
As
and,
to you, you guys would love to have it, right? We could talk about Strats. You like mods. You were talking about things, all sorts of stuff that you could do.
Yeah. It'd be kind of fun to talk about some of the things you can do and some simple mods and stuff like that. But anyway,
I'd
another
love to
day.
have you back on. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
we talked about it before, and I did an interview. I've got a long interview with Simon. We talked about his history, which is really great. How you started getting into amps and moving from the UK and then bringing AC30s over. And I'll edit that. It was long, so I want to edit it down. So since we talked a lot about this, I can direct people over there, so we can get that up there pretty soon too.
Awesome.
Somebody's asking, what's the current lead time on a juggler if you ordered it today? That was a real quick question.
Yeah, like I said earlier, the juggler actually has the longest wait time of all of our pedals, and it's currently 10 months to a year.
Okay.
Not true of our other pedals. Only a couple of months for pretty much everything else.
Okay, here's what I would say to you, because I love the juggler, but if you have an amp that you really like, I think the Harlot's great. I have the Minstrel coming in, and Simon talked about, if you'll going back, like what's kind of a Dumble pedal. What I find about your overdrive in the Harlot, and I haven't gotten the Minstrel yet, they feel really great. They feel like the juggler as well. Like, it feels really good. They're really interactive. So any of the pedals that I've tried of yours, I've always felt like it's an amp. It feels like the amp overdrive, which is a great thing. And that's something that kind of, while you order your juggler, like you said, the other ones I think you'd be very happy with them, as I am as well. So.
Oh, right on. Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I mean, if you're just looking for the juggler style clean tone, you could just get a Squire or a Maiden, and it'll do the same thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then run your overdrive.
And then you could run overdrive of your choice into that,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we can start keeping. We can go on just for. So, BB, thank you so much as well for helping out, as always. You're the man.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate it, and thank you once again, Simon, for everything. Everybody, go over to.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks. You've been very kind, and I always like chatting with you. And congratulations on your channel and all that you do online. Excellent resource. I
I
enjoy
really
it.
appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Cool.
All right, guys. I'll see everybody soon, and we'll yeah, see you in like I don't know, next week, 2 weeks,